Greetings everyone, I'm Adam Haritan. I'm hanging out here in the woods on this beautiful winter morning, and in this video I'd like to answer a great question that I recently received regarding the control of an aggressive parasitic fungus. Now for those of you who are on my email list, you probably saw that I recently sent out an email saying, hey, if you have any questions that you'd like to ask me, let me know. I may feature it in a video. And a man named Blair Glenn, better known as Arborist Blair Glenn on YouTube, took me up on the offer. And he asked a great question regarding Armillaria fungi. Armillaria, for those of you who don't know, is the genus that produces honey mushrooms. These fungi are known for the damage they can inflict on living trees, so it's no surprise that an arborist, like Blair Glenn, would ask the following question. Is there a fungus that attacks Armillaria but not the tree, potentially helping to resolve the problem? This is an excellent question, and it's one that not only is relevant to the work of foresters and arborists, but it's relevant to homeowners as well. If you have trees on your property, there is a chance that Armillaria fungi could show up and infect some of your living trees, eventually leading to, or at least contributing to, the demise of your infected trees. And I say that because some Armillaria species can only be mildly parasitic, and will only contribute to the decline of a tree's health rather than be the leading cause of its death. Now, interestingly, there is quite a bit of research on the biological control of Armillaria fungi, and that's a topic that we are going to explore throughout the rest of this video. So, if you're interested in learning more about the fungal control of a parasitic fungus, perhaps one that grows on your property, come take a walk with me. Let's go see if we could first find physical signs of Armillaria in these woods. So Armillaria can be observed all year round, even if you don't see the mushrooms that it produces. And we can see signs of this fungus in all seasons because the Armillaria genus produces these very characteristic shoestring-like structures known as Rhizome Morphs. And Rhizome Morphs are dense aggregations of fungal strands called hyphae that are involved in the transport of nutrients and water. These Rhizome Morphs can be found on logs, stumps, branches, and trees. And while other fungal genera produce rhizomorphs, none of them look like these thick, rope-like black cords that are produced by Armillaria. Now, Armillaria comprises at least 40 species worldwide and probably much more. Here in Pennsylvania, we see the honey mushrooms that Armillaria produces typically late August through about November. And because honey mushrooms are decent, edible mushrooms, I like to harvest them, though only when they're very young, before the cap's fully open. And I do cook them well because honey mushrooms can cause gastrointestinal distress if not prepared properly. As I already mentioned, many Armillaria species are considered to be pathogens on a broad range of trees, shrubs, and even on some herbaceous plants. And in the case of trees, Armillaria can eat away at the roots and lower trunks and eventually kill trees. And this disease is known as Malaria Root Rot. Now, it's important to note that damage to trees seems to be greater in introduced tree plantations and in areas that are quite disturbed. So think urban and suburban landscapes compared to natural healthy forest settings. Now, Armillaria fungi can certainly be found in more mature forests, but it seems that in these situations, Armillaria oftentimes targets the weaker trees. In many cases, within intact forests, the more mature healthy trees are able to successfully ward off infection. So as much as people like to talk about the destruction that Armillaria fungi causes, Armillaria fungi actually play significant ecological roles in the world. For example, by targeting weaker trees in healthy forests and allowing the sequestered carbon to be introduced back into the soil. And many Armillaria species are largely saprotrophic rather than parasitic. So their roles involve cleaning up the forest by almost exclusively decomposing wood from dead trees and passing the sequestered nutrients through the ecological line. And that's what's probably going on right here. This is a dead ash tree, and we could see physical signs of the emerald ash borer, which probably directly killed this tree. Then the Armillaria fungi came in and started to decompose the rest of the tree. And perhaps most interesting of all is that some Armillaria species are important mycorrhizal symbionts, notably with orchid species. So Armillaria is an incredibly diverse genus, at least ecologically speaking, as it fulfills multiple roles depending on the species of Armillaria and depending on the environmental situation. But for our discussion today, we're mostly interested in the pathogenic role of Armillaria. Now, there are many ways that foresters and arborists and homeowners deal with Armillaria. For example, by taking preventive measures and planting tree species that are resistant to Armillaria infection. But once a tree does succumb to Armillaria infection, then pulling out infected roots and stumps can reduce the likelihood that Armillaria will survive and continue to propagate itself in that area. And of course, more extreme methods to treat Armillaria infection involve the application of fungicides and chemical fumigants, which of course provide a whole host of nasty downstream side effects. But is there a fungus that attacks Armillaria, but not the tree, potentially helping to resolve the problem? Well, according to the research, the answer seems to be, it depends. And over the next few minutes, we're going to discuss lots of studies and lots of fungi that either provide direct answers for Blair's question, or only provide partial or indirect answers with plenty of caveats. So some of the more current and supportive studies regarding the control of Armillaria involve one fungus that you might be familiar with. And that fungus is the sulfur tuft mushroom, Hyphiloma fasciculare. The sulfur tuft is a poisonous, small to medium-sized yellowish mushroom with greenish gills that grows in clusters on both deciduous and conifer wood. And research on the anti-Armillaria effects of the sulfur tuft dates back at least to the late 1980s, when researchers discovered that sulfur tuft fungi, along with several other cord-forming, wood-inhabiting fungi, were antagonistic against different Armillaria species. And just as a side note, cord-forming fungi are fungi that form structures that are somewhat similar to Rhizome Morphs, though the fungal aggregations of hyphae in cord-forming fungi are typically less complex than true Rhizome Morphs. Now, in this particular study, it's important to note that all the tests were performed in the laboratory and not out in real-world situations. But what the researchers found was that the hyphae of sulfur tuft fungi had the ability to displace colonies of Armillaria on blocks of wood. The researchers concluded that one of the more practical implications of the study concerns the possible use of cord-forming fungi for biological control of Armillaria root pathogens. This study was referenced again in a subsequent paper published in 1993, in which the author stated that some species, for example, Hyphiloma fasciculare and Phanerochaete velutina, are extremely combative against Armillaria species, either replacing them or preventing outgrowth from woody resources. Fast forward a couple of years, and in 2000, we really start to see some interesting research. More specifically, researchers began to study the anti-Armillaria effects of Hyphiloma fasciculare quite rigorously. So similar to what we saw in the 1988 paper, researchers in this particular study found that sulfur tuft hyphae could either displace Armillaria fungi or could prevent Armillaria fungi from growing. And to take the research one step further, the researchers performed field experiments in which they tested the biological control of Armillaria fungi in 2 forested sites in British Columbia containing Douglas fir trees and lodgepole pine trees. And after inoculating cut trees with sulfur tuft fungi, the researchers found that after a few years, sulfur tuft mushrooms successfully colonized stumps that were previously colonized by Armillaria. And although the study did not run long enough for the researchers to document reduced mortality effects in the forested plots, the researchers concluded that, based on everything observed to date, Hyphiloma fasciculare remains a good candidate for biological control of Armillaria root disease by exclusion. Fortunately, a follow-up study was conducted in 2004, and again, researchers wanted to see if inoculating stumps with sulfur tuft fungi in areas replete with Armillaria infection would reduce tree mortality caused by Armillaria root disease. So in this study, researchers analyzed 5 test sites, and after 3 to 5 years of treatment, all plots that were treated with sulfur tuft fungi had lower tree mortality caused by Armillaria. So let's discuss this for a couple of seconds. In areas with armillaria infestation, the physical process of inoculating stumps with sulfur tuft fungi led to reduced tree mortality caused by armillaria infection over the time span of a couple of years. Put another way, you have an area where trees are dying from armillaria, you bring in Hyphiloma fasciculare, the sulfur tuft, and over a couple of years, less trees are dying from armillaria. Now, Blair's original question was, is there a fungus that attacks armillaria but not the tree, potentially helping to resolve the problem? Well, based on the results that we've discussed so far, the answer is yes, no, and perhaps maybe. There is a fungus that displaces and attacks armillaria, and that fungus is the sulfur tuft, Hyphiloma fasciculare. However, sulfur tuft mushrooms are decomposers of trees, specifically dead trees. So it's unlikely that sulfur tuft fungi could save a living tree already infected by armillaria. However, although sulfur tuft fungi may not be directly responsible for keeping a single tree alive, multiple stump inoculations of sulfur tuft fungi in forests replete with armillaria root disease could ultimately save other living trees by displacing and preventing the future growth of armillaria fungi. So the effects of Hyphiloma fasciculare aren't necessarily immediate, but they manifest in the long run. Now, the results do seem promising, but there are some important things to keep in mind as expressed by the study's researchers. First, it wouldn't be as simple as bringing sulfur tuft mushrooms into an area, walking away, and expecting everything to be fine years later. Hyphiloma fasciculare would need to be continuously monitored and would have to have fresh resources available in order to thrive, resources like fresh woody debris, and the repercussions of increasing the abundance of sulfur tuft mushrooms in a specific area are currently unknown. Now, it's true that sulfur tuft mushrooms can be naturally prolific even without the help of humans, but by artificially increasing the abundance of this one particular species, there could be perhaps unforeseen consequences for other organisms and for the general ecology of that immediate area and in surrounding areas. But for now, it does seem like Hyphiloma fasciculare could be used in the biological control of armillaria fungi. Okay, so I found some more armillaria fungi. We could see it colonizing this fallen wood right here. And this is the saprotrophic version. It's eating away mostly at the lignin, maybe some of the other plant cell wall compounds as well. But for our discussion today, we're largely focusing on the parasitic, the pathogenic version of armillaria. And wouldn't you know, there are more mushrooms that have been tested for the anti-armillaria effects. And some of these mushrooms you're probably familiar with. So there was an interesting paper that was published in 2006 documenting the anti-armillaria effects of 5 fungal species. And this was in the context of peach tree mortality. All of the experiments in this study were conducted in a lab, either using petri dishes, wood blocks, or root segments, and results showed that all 5 species, Ganoderma lucidum, Hyphiloma fasciculare, Phanerochaete velutina, Schizophyllum commune, and Xylaria hypoxylon, demonstrated anti-armillaria effects. And to highlight some examples in this study, you can see here on the top that Hyphiloma fasciculare hyphae are growing toward and eventually covering the hyphae of Armillaria tubescens, which is the ringless honey mushroom. And on the bottom, we could see that hyphae from the split gill fungus, Schizophyllum commune, is encircling a colony of Armillaria melea, which produces the classic honey mushroom. Now, according to the researchers, Schizophyllum commune and Xylaria hypoxylon would be the most promising candidates for field-scale evaluations to restrict colonization of dead or dying peach trees by armillaria. Interestingly, Ganoderma lucidum also had powerful anti-armillaria effects compared to the other species, but because Ganoderma lucidum can be quite pathogenic towards living trees, the researchers did not recommend its use in field trials against armillaria. And yet another study on this topic was published in 1990 in which researchers looked at over a dozen fungal species and tested their effects against the particular Australian species of armillaria known as Armillaria luteobubulina. And again, a lot of the fungi tested in this study are ones you're probably familiar with, including turkey tail, which was placed in the Coriolus genus back then, Fistulina hepatica, the beefsteak polypore, several Felinus species, a Pluteus species, and several others. Now, many of these fungi showed strong antagonizing effects against Armillaria, but most interesting of all was that turkey tail performed exceptionally well. Not only did it inhibit the growth of Armillaria rhizome morphs, it was the only isolate significantly to replace Armillaria luteobubulina on eucalyptus wood. Now again, just like we saw with the previous studies on Hyphiloma fasciculare, we're still dealing with fungi that attack wood, but most of these fungi attack dead trees. So although it seems that these anti-Armillaria fungi may not be able to save living trees that are already infected by Armillaria, they could be introduced into areas that have Armillaria, and over time they could antagonize Armillaria, displace and remove Armillaria from a given area, and help to reduce tree mortality. Okay, now it's about to get really interesting, and Blair, I hope you made it this far, and everyone else, I hope you made it this far as well, because we're about to talk about a fungus that may potentially and finally answer Blair's question in the affirmative. And this is a fungus in a completely different phylum of fungi, and of course in a different genus, and that genus is Trichoderma. So Trichoderma is a genus containing lots of different species that are very common in soil, on decaying wood, and even on other fungi. So if I pick up a handful of soil right here, I wouldn't be surprised if there are Trichoderma species within the collection of microorganisms in my hand. They're incredibly common. There are hundreds of species in the Trichoderma genus, and if you visit a garden supply center, you may see some commercial products that contain Trichoderma species. Now, why in the world would garden products contain Trichoderma fungi? Well, some Trichoderma species have antifungal properties against soil-borne fungal pathogens. And interestingly, some Trichoderma species have antifungal properties specifically against Armillaria fungi. And this research goes back decades. One of the earliest reports of the anti-Armillaria effects of Trichoderma was published in 1957, when researchers discovered that Trichoderma species killed Armillaria fungi in experimental trials, particularly when a fumigant was added to the mix. An interesting study from 2014 showed that bark mulch that was pre-treated with a Trichoderma species inhibited the growth of Armillaria, specifically on Armillaria-infected strawberry plants. And in this study, the researchers seemed particularly optimistic, concluding that Trichoderma atroviridae SC1, which is a particular strain of Trichoderma, could be useful for the prevention and control of Armillaria gallica in agricultural systems. And in one of the most recent studies on the anti-Armillaria effects of Trichoderma, researchers performed a field experiment in an area that was heavily infested with Armillaria fungi. The researchers applied Trichoderma species to turkey oak seedlings as a root treatment before planting them. And after 6 months, the oak seedlings that were pre-treated with Trichoderma had better survival rates compared to the seedlings that were not treated with Trichoderma. So Trichoderma seems to be a pretty good answer to Blair's question, as this is a fungus that attacks Armillaria, but supposedly not the host plant, potentially helping to resolve the problem. Now, of course, the research is not conclusive on this topic, and there's a relative lack of field experiments compared to laboratory experiments. And many of the products on the market that contain Trichoderma may not contain species of Trichoderma that directly antagonize Armillaria. And it may not be economically nor logistically feasible to treat entire forests with Trichoderma, and we don't know the full implications of heavy doses of Trichoderma, specifically on the effects on other microorganisms like mycorrhizal fungi. And some researchers do suggest that heavy doses of Trichoderma may negatively impact mycorrhizal fungi, which would have detrimental effects on many tree species. But it does seem like, looking through all the research, that Trichoderma, along with Hyphiloma fasciculare and some other fungi, are probably the best candidates when we look at fungi for the biological control of Armillaria. So Blair, I hope that answers your question, and for everyone else watching this video, I hope you learned something new about the fascinating lives of fungi that antagonize other fungi. Keep in mind that although the pathogenic effects of armillaria can certainly be exacerbated in introduced tree plantations and in suburban and urban landscapes, these fungi aren't universally bad. I mean, some people might consider their effects to be inconvenient, but these fungi do perform incredibly essential roles in forested ecosystems worldwide as mycorrhizal symbionts, as saprotrophic decomposers, and yes, even as misunderstood parasites. Thanks for watching this video. I encourage you to check out Blair's YouTube channel, Arborist Blair Glenn on YouTube. If you want to stay in touch with me, feel free to subscribe to this YouTube channel, Learn Your Land. You can also head on over to learnyourland.com, sign up for the email newsletter. You can also stay in touch via social media on Instagram and Facebook at Learn Your Land. Thanks again for watching this video. I'll see you on the next one.